So what Leanne had asked me to talk a little bit about is making high quality hay. So what I'm going to cover over the next few minutes here is to talk a little bit about why forage quality deserves our focus, why it's so important to the overall animal production scheme that we've got, and how we can better improve that overall as well. And I want to give a little bit of an overview of forage quality. I mean, this is a subject that we literally could teach over the course of a whole semester for a class, but I want to give you kind of the nugget of what is really important here with regard to forage quality. And then just a real quick intro to some of the terminology. I'm actually going to gloss over most of that terminology just because, you know, it tends to be an alphabet soup of different terms. But I want to go into detail about a couple of those forage quality terms and why that's so important for us. And then I want to spend the bulk of my time really talking about the factors that affect forage quality and how we can actually improve forage quality by paying attention to some of those details. Let me first start by talking about the importance of forage quality and how directly it is tied to profitability. And whether that's dealing with beef cattle and a cow-calf operation, which we measure that profitability and our calving rates and the number of dollars per acre that we're able to generate off of various stocking rates with those cattle, or in the case of dairy cattle, and it shows up in the milk tank every day, twice a day in many cases, and sometimes 3 times a day, depending on how frequently they're getting milk. So forage quality is important in all of those aspects. And so what I want to spend some time talking with you about is how that actually interacts with keeping these animals in good production and therefore high profitability. From a beef cattle perspective, and really largely also for a dairy cattle perspective as well, we think about this in terms of body condition. There's a different scoring system for dairy cattle on body condition, but for beef cattle, we want a body condition score of about a 5 to 6, a 5 to 6. Now, you have the low end of this range too, and it goes all the way down to a 1. But you can see in this screen here, we have one animal there that's depicted as a body condition score of 2. You're seeing a lot of ribs. You're seeing every bone in her body, basically a very emaciated animal. That animal is very unlikely to breed back. Whereas a body condition score of 5 and 6, we have a much better success rate there of getting them bred back. You know, and every time I talk about body condition scoring, I always have to say that, you know, I always tell my mother-in-law that she's a 10 in my eyes, and if she ever figures out exactly what I'm talking about, we're probably going to be in a lot of trouble. But body condition scoring is extremely important. And by the way, Leanne, I just realized you're recording this, and I hope that my mother-in-law doesn't actually find out I just said that. But the body condition scoring here is extremely relevant to pregnancy rate. There was some work that was done down in Florida a few years ago, and they were looking at this relationship between body condition scoring on the various ranches there in Florida and the percentage rate as a percent of those exposed, how many of them actually got pregnant. And what they found is that there was a fairly linear to curvilinear response, and above a body condition score of 5.5 or 6, it kind of levels off. You don't really see much improvement. In fact, if you get some animals that are very high body condition score, you can actually drop that pregnancy rate curve a little bit. But the point is that if you have that 5 to 6 body condition score, you can really keep this. I'm going to see if I can mark on the screen here. You can really keep it right in this neighborhood of roughly, if I can draw this all the way over, roughly about 90% or so, or above. And the goal here is that within a couple weeks here, you want to try to get as many of those animals pregnant as possible within 1 or 2 estrus cycles. So within 21 to 42 days or so, you want to try to make sure that all of those end up getting pregnant. The reason being is if you go too much longer than that, what can happen is that you end up with extending your calving interval. Now, the goal for any cow-calf operation should be to have a calf on the ground every 365 days. And you can see with the body condition score data that they have here, is that if we're in this 5 to 6 range, we're fairly close going to be right around that 360, 365 day calving interval, which is really ideal for us. If we drop down around a body condition score of 4 or so, then we're talking about 380, maybe even 390. You know, you're talking essentially an extra month worth of having to feed that cow to get the same calf off of her. So in other words, you're feeding her for an extra month for the same money. And the point is that we really need to ensure that every cow is having a calf every 365 days, so that we can minimize the amount of feeding cost that we have on a per unit that we actually sell off that farm. Now, the best way to keep good flesh on those animals is make sure that they're being fed well, and in particular at the time of year when they are being most taxed by the nutrient demand that they have, and that's during the lactation phase. So supplementing a lactating beef cow, for example, is one of the most challenging parts of the cow-calf cycle, is to making sure that we are providing enough nutrients there for that lactating beef cow, because oftentimes she has slid a little bit in body condition scoring right after pregnancy. So we're at least wanting to maintain that, maybe even give a little bit more body condition score to that animal. So if we look at, for example, Bermudagrass or tall fescue here, and the effects that maturity has on quality. If we look at Bermudagrass, we typically want to try to shoot for about 4 to 5 week intervals. Sometimes that goes out to week 6 or maybe even out to week 8. We've had some growers this year that have been forced to cut a lot later. For tall fescue, for example, we want to really try to hit that in late boot stage. And many folks will go well into the early head stage or maybe even to the doe stage. And the impact that that has on supplementation for a lactating beef cow is pretty substantial. Because if you look at the typical range in crude protein and TDN, total digestible nutrients here for those two, and we're talking about protein and energy there. If we go much more mature, in the case of, for example, Bermudagrass, we can really get down below about 60% TDN, which can be really challenging to try to feed without any supplementation, for example. For tall fescue, certainly after we get past the early head stage and we get into the doe stage, we can start seeing some really low quality feed out there. So what kind of implications does this have if we're trying to feed that lactating beef cow to make sure she at least doesn't lose any body condition score? We're going to have to supplement. And what I did was I went through some numbers with a 50-50 mix of corn gluten and soy hulls, and what it would take to supplement these various types of maturities here. In the case of tall fescue, we really didn't need to supplement anything because the energy is quite good and the crude protein is quite good until we got into that doe stage. And once we start getting that seed development going on there in the tall fescue, the quality goes down really, really quickly. And by the way, this does not even consider the effect of tall fescue toxicosis, which is a whole nother conversation. But what I want to point out too, especially for those of us in the South, is that our Bermudagrass, if we wait too long there to cut Bermudagrass, we really start seeing that forage quality drop pretty quickly. Notice there for the 8 week, if we've been delayed in cutting our Bermudagrass for 8 weeks, we have something that is very, very low quality. And, you know, we start calling straw at about 45% TDN. So what we're dealing with at 8-week-old Bermudagrass is what we're really feeding is straw. And any cow is not going to be able to, even a dry cow is not going to be able to maintain herself on straw. We're going to have to provide some supplemental energy there. Otherwise, she's going to lose some body condition scoring. So it's really, really important that we focus on maturity. And that's going to be another point that I'll make again later on. But just suffice it to say that the supplement cost here per head per day reflects the damage that's done by waiting that late. So if we're talking about 6 or 8 week old Bermudagrass, in addition to the $1.50, $1.75, maybe $2 per head per day that we have in feeding that animal, just the hay part of that, we're going to have to add to that 43 cents or 68 cents per head per day in supplement cost. So pretty substantial economic impact there, even at relatively moderate prices for supplementation at the moment. Now, I'm going to say a few things that are rather inflammatory for the lay audience, because a lot of folks have this mythos that crude protein is the ultimate measure of forage quality. And it's very, very important. Do not get me wrong. Crude protein is an extraordinarily important measure. It's an important nutrient in our diets for ruminant animals. But I would submit to you it's the most overrated measure of quality that we have. Crude protein is 1880s technology, and it's simply this. It's a measure of the total amount of nitrogen that is in that forage as a concentration, and we multiply that by 6.25. We could also do that by dividing by 16%. 16% is the fraction of crude protein or protein that is nitrogen. So if you were to look at, elementally speaking, on average, protein is about 16% nitrogen, but we accomplish the same thing by multiplying that total nitrogen by 6.25. It's simply just total nitrogen, nothing else. So it tells you really nothing about the form that nitrogen is in. If we have protein there, it will count that, of course, but if we have bound protein, something that's heat damaged, for example, and we're going to talk about hay heating a little bit later on, that's included in that measure. Nitrates may actually be included in that measure as well, because that's part of the nitrogen that's in the forage as well. And I've had cases where Bermudagrass, for example, was maybe 18% crude protein. And you look down at the bottom where the nitrates are listed, and it's 8,000 parts per million nitrates. And the point is that Bermudagrass normally is about 13, 14% at best. And if we go much higher than that, then there's a very good chance that we're dealing with high nitrates that's there as well. By and large, in our area of the country, protein requirements are relatively easily met. Now, if you go out into the arid desert Southwest, that's a whole different ball of wax, especially some of those very overly mature native warm season species that they have out there are very low in protein. But in our situation, most of the time, we're dealing with forage that is relatively easily going to meet the protein requirements of most of the livestock we're dealing with. Now, protein is somewhat related to maturity. As it goes down, as maturity increases, crude protein does go down. But it really doesn't tell you anything at all about the most limiting nutrient, which is energy content. Energy is really the biggest limitation in most cases. Not every case, but most cases we're dealing with energy deficit. I just want to say it is important, but it is overemphasized. So are there better tools there to express forage quality? And I think there is. So let me kind of build to that. And I want to give you an example of this. This is a very simplistic example of the concept, okay? On the left-hand side of the screen, you have a picture of wheat bran cereal, okay? And on the right-hand side of the screen, you have a picture of just tasty spaghetti and meatballs with some garlic bread with it. Now, if y'all are not already hungry, you know, and here Eastern time, it's 11:15. I'm ready to eat already as well. But the point I want to really make about this is what's the difference between these two? And the difference between these two can, you know, there's a lot of differences, obviously, taste and appearance, crunchiness, and those sorts of things. But the point that I really want to make is that fundamentally they have these two differences, which is one is very high in digestible energy, and one is much more easily eaten in large quantities. So in other words, my wife has to stand over me with a stick to make sure that I eat one full bowl of wheat bran cereal. But she has to stand with that same stick to make sure I don't eat more than one bowl of the spaghetti and meatballs. The point is that we're talking about how much digestible energy we can get into these animals at a given point in time. And so the digestibility portion of that, as well as the dry matter intake portion of that, is what drives forage quality. And the same is true whether we're talking about a straw bale that's on the left-hand side of the screen, or some high-quality, dairy quality alfalfa on the right-hand side of the screen. What we're fundamentally focused in on is high digestibility and how much of it we can get into those animals. So my definition of high-quality forages has two components. Forage that is highly digestible, such as having high TDN, or in the case of a dairy cattle diet, we're looking at high levels of metabolizable energy, net lactation, net energy for lactation, net energy for maintenance and reproduction, and all those sorts of things. But it also has to do with how much we can actually get into those animals. So can we get enough dry matter into those animals to make it where they can make sure that they're meeting all of their needs? And the way that has been come up with to give us one number that approaches this need, that really expresses this in a more simplistic way, is relative forage quality. Now, relative forage quality has been around since the early 2000s. I think, in fact, in the year 2000, it was developed by colleagues at the University of Florida and the University of Wisconsin. And it's simply this: it's a measure of TDN, the percentage that's TDN, by the percentage that is dry matter intake, and then it's divided by 1.23. And the reason for that is to relativize it to a standard of about 100, which is what low quality alfalfa would be, an RFQ of 100. Okay, that also is the number, an RFQ of 100, that if we drop below that, we're going to have to supplement even a dry cow, most likely. All right, so I'll show you that in just a moment. But here's a case in point of where this can become important. Let's say, for example, we had a pile of alfalfa and we had a pile of Bermudagrass, and they were almost statistically identical in terms of TDN. And in this case, this is a real world example. I chose these on purpose. And if we look at the dry matter intake of these two, there's a stark difference between Bermudagrass and alfalfa. Alfalfa is more energy dense. It's not as high in terms of percent. These are identical basically in terms of percent digestible energy in the form of TDN. But my point is that the animals can actually eat more of the alfalfa because of the weight per unit volume is actually higher. The point is here is there is a difference in the amount at 10% bloom through the rest of the season. And that gets a little bit more challenging. And if we're in a dairy, for example, we may be willing to substitute a little bit less stand life. I may give up that year 4 if I can cut some higher quality feed if we cut it at the bud stage. So that might be something to look at there too. I will say this, and folks have heard me talk a lot about cutting height on Bermudagrass or any species for that matter. We need to really be careful about cutting height, but especially true on Bermudagrass, because the stolons and the rhizomes, but a lot of it is coming from the stolons, that's where the storage organ is at. And if we slam that disc mower right down on the ground and a cloud of dust is coming out from it as we go across the field, we're cutting up and doing a lot of damage to those stolons. Plus, that last inch or so that we're cutting out of that Bermudagrass, not very highly digestible. whole lot more manure, right? So the point is we really need to adjust that so that we're staying at about a 3-inch cutting height and not so low as what's depicted here. The other point I would say, and I can't seem to go without a talk on grass growth without saying these most important terms, is grass grows grass. If we leave a little bit more grass out there, it grows back faster, it grows back stronger, fewer weed problems, and we're able to really hit those benchmarks for 4-week-old grass much more frequently as a result. Now, the second on this list is the forage species. And this is an extraordinarily important part of this as well, is choosing the highest quality forage species that will persist in our environment. Now, that persistence part is a very important aspect of the economics. So if, you know, we could grow a lot of things here in the Southeast, but if it doesn't persist for us, then it's really not something that needs to be considered. At least persist enough that we can pay it back. I do want to point out here the differences that we see in RFQ. So as I said before, you know, we really want to shoot for about a 100 to 130 or so there for most beef cattle operations. And if we look at, for example, Bermudagrass, our average, now this, let me walk you through this, this graph. The black bar here represents, let me get my pen going here. This black bar represents the average, all right? That's the average. This range from yellow to green represents a standard deviation. In other words, roughly half of the samples are going to come from or half the results are going to fall within that range. Actually, I'll take that back. That is 2 standard deviations, and that is 2/3 of the samples will fall within that range. The gray bar that represents that is, if we go from here to here, 95% of the samples will fall within that range, and that's indicative of what total range we might see, you know, more typically in the Southeast. Now, this came from our lab. This is about 16,000 samples that came to generate this graph, so you get a good idea of the scope of the work here. But what I want to point out is if we go to this next slide and we overlay there what a dry cow is going to need versus a lactating cow, there's only a handful of these that on average are going to fall into that category. Ryegrass, for example, our small grains, our alfalfa, and our legume mixed species. Those that have legume in them do a great job of consistently getting up into that range that's fitting to feed to a lactating beef cow. So it's really important that we include legumes into our system. The third thing on this list is bale storage. I'm going to quickly wrap up the last few here, but just suffice it to say that when we store bales outside without any kind of protection at all, I think it goes without saying that we got some real challenges there. Not only are we talking about reductions in quality, but in this case also reductions in quantity. 74% of the bale's volume in this case was in that outer 14 inches that just wasted away to nothing. So that's just not a workable solution. This is some work that was done by Kevin Shinners up at the University of Wisconsin, where they took twine wrapped round bales and put them on the ground and looked at the moisture gradient around those bales. And what you can see here is that that bottom part of the bale is where you get most of your moisture wicking up. Now, you certainly get some moisture along the sides of those bales as well. If we elevate that bale in some way and put it up, in this case they did it experimentally by putting it up on a pallet, you break that contact with the ground, you get less wicking, you still get some of that moisture on the sides of the bales, but nothing like if it was stored on the ground. Now, I will point out that this was in Wisconsin. This is not Georgia or Alabama or any of the southeastern states. And the weather's quite a bit different up there than what it is down here for us. And the reality is that since we don't really have any freezing conditions that last that long, we have a lot more moisture and a lot more wicking that's happening there. And as a result, our damage would be even more severe than what is shown here. What's worse is the fact that as we get more moisture there, those bales will deform more, and we get, as they deform, not only are they more difficult to handle, but you're getting more and more wicking occurring there. So you can kind of see in this graphic from the New Holland Haymaker's Handbook, we could have some real challenges here in how much of that bale we actually pick up when we go to pick that bale up. And that's why all your neighbors, when you see them going down the road with one of these on the fork on the back of the tractor, the bottom third of the bale is gone because it was left where the storage area is at, or on the road somewhere along the way. The point being is that we really need to do a better job of storage. Now, net wrapping can help quite a bit, and the one on the right actually shows a net wrap bale and what typically would happen there. So it does help some, but it doesn't completely get away from the moisture issues that we have of storing hay outside on the ground. Because if we look at a net wrap bale relative to a twine wrap bale, we still have some damage that's being done there. So we need to be aware of that. And by the way, in our area, our average, even for net wrap bales, is going to be 3, maybe even 4 inches on average. And there's some years where it's 6 to 8 inches worth of weathering loss that occurs there. So if we look at the storage loss associated with that, with a 5-foot bale, for example, at 4 inches, 5-foot bale is saying that's 25% of the bale that's being lost just in that outside 4 inches. That's a huge amount of volume when you stop to think about the amount that's in those outer 4 inches. Now, rain is number 4 on this list, and this is where I get a lot of strange looks. Why is rain damage so far down on this list? Well, it's important, but I can guarantee you that cutting at advanced maturity, especially with things like Bermudagrass, can really do more damage than the rain does. And I'll give you some examples of that in just a moment. But rain damage definitely is an issue. If we look at some data here for tall fescue hay, and this is some work that was done several years ago at the University of Kentucky, where we have no rain damage. The dry matter intake was good. We had relatively low NDF, or relatively high NDF to begin with, but if we look at it relative to the rain damage leaches out some of the water-soluble carbohydrates, and as a result, the fiber levels actually go up and the digestibility goes down. And the cows can tell the difference. We actually see a difference in dry matter intake as well. So once we think about how this is going to impact us, what kind of rain damage, how much rain do we see some damage occurring? And it does depend a little bit on a lot of different factors, but the species that we have out there is a good example of that. This is some work that was done out at Arkansas with various levels of simulated rainfall on orchard grass and Bermudagrass. And what they found is that if we got just 1/4 inch of rain on Bermudagrass, it really didn't affect that much. But a 1/4 inch of rain on orchard grass definitely has an impact. An inch of rain on orchard grass is just too much to handle. It also does have an impact on when in the drying process occurs. I don't have time to go into the details of that, but just suffice it to say that the closer you get to drying and the more rain that you get there, the more damage that's going to occur. By the way, this dry matter loss, a lot of that is coming from the loss of the sugar content, which is the goody part. So that's what we're really wanting to try to preserve as much as possible, is the sugar. But let me give you a thought experiment here about whether or not the risk of rain damage, specifically on Bermudagrass, in some cases may be overblown. So let me give you a case in point. A little bit of a fact here is that every day after 4 weeks, on average, now this is not all the time, but on average, a rule of thumb, you're going to lose about 0.5 percentage point in TDN for every day after 4 weeks. All right. If we waited a week to cut that Bermudagrass from 4 weeks to 5 weeks, waited 7 extra days times 0.5 percentage points, that is 3.5% drop in TDN in that Bermudagrass to avoid a 1/2 inch rain. Let's say that's all that ended up happening, is there was 1/2 inch rain. If that rainfall had occurred on that Bermudagrass, especially if it occurred relatively early on, you're probably going to be seeing less than a 1% decrease in TDN. So the point is that you would be better off taking your lumps and getting a little bit of rain damage on it than waiting a week in terms of quality. Now, I'm not saying that this is universal and every case is going to be different. Every farm is going to be different. Every situation is going to be different. But what I am saying is think about that decision It's not just a simple, well, it's going to rain, so I need to wait. It's not just that simple. It's more to it than that. The fifth thing I would say is moisture at baling is very important, and I don't have time to go into all the dynamics of hay heating in response to high moisture, but just suffice it to say that our target for good dry hay for round hay should be 15%. For square hay, we can get by with 18% without heating up too much, but we sometimes will get a lot more mold at that level. So again, even with that, I like to have it down around 15% as well. If we do have heat damage, and as that heat increment increases, what happens to the protein? Well, the amount of usable protein actually dips up just a little bit, but it quickly falls off as that heat increment increases. But if we look at the heat damaged protein, the part that actually becomes undigestible, we can quickly see that that heat damaged protein actually increases pretty quickly there. The other thing I would like to point out is sometimes there's a little bit of a conundrum here because we do see a difference in dry matter intake there. And a lot of it has to do with, as that heat damage occurs, it caramelizes things a little bit. It actually makes it taste a little bit better. Same reason why we make caramel, and we put caramel ice cream on our sundaes or whatever, you know, and that's the sort of thing that actually makes it taste just that much better. And in this case, the animals respond to it as well. Plus, they're trying to take in more to meet the deficit of their protein deficit that they might have there too. So there's that too. Then the sixth thing on this list is variety choice. Now this is way down the list, but suffice it to say that variety has a huge impact in some cases over the long span, especially. By choosing the right variety, we can increase our quality overall. Now I'm not necessarily talking about the alfalfa component here, because there's some new varieties of alfalfa, for example, that are low or reduced lignin, and that's going to make a huge difference in quality. But even in crops that we don't have any kind of breeding selection or genetic trait that's been added to it to increase digestibility, we do see some selectivity that has occurred over time for digestibility. In the case of, for example, Tifton 85, if we compare everything to Coastal, which is kind of the gold standard, Tifton 85 has more digestibility and more yield. So in my estimation, Tifton 85 is really the king of Bermudagrasses. TIF 44 is one that has higher digestibility, but it has lower yield. Alicia has about the same yield as Coastal, but it has lower digestibility. So that's a challenge there. And Russell is one that has high yields and reasonably good digestibility as well. And that's a good variety as well. Even though it came from Auburn, we'll give it grace even for that. Just kidding, all to my Auburn friends. I'm just kidding. But I would say that there is a difference here with Tifton 85, especially with regard to NDF digestibility. And if we look at Coastal, cut on a 3-week interval, we see about 40% digestibility. With Tifton 85, cut at that same week interval, we're going to see much more digestibility. In fact, 50% more, roughly, digestibility out of the Tifton 85 at that 3-week interval. Similar kind of thing there, even at the 6-week interval. And we really see an improvement there in higher digestibility of that fiber component. Now, the last thing that I'm going to mention is fertilization. And a lot of folks will say, well, why in the world is that the last one on your list? I thought well-fertilized means good quality hay. Well, it does sometimes, and then it doesn't sometimes. And one of the real challenges is parsing out what's really happening here. Because if we look at nitrogen response in terms of protein here, this is increasing levels of nitrogen and increasing levels of protein. And by the way, in this case, there were 2 different soil types here. So just draw a line between the average of all those and you can kind of get a sense of what's going on. Yes, as the nitrogen increased, our protein increased. I would say that as we go really high on this range, we start adding a lot more nitrates than we do true protein. Now, if we look at some older work where Glenn Burton looked at the nitrogen response here in crude protein, and this was back in the day when nitrogen was really, really cheap, like less than 5 cents a pound cheap. And they put out, just for kicks and grins, they put out 0, 400, and 1400, that's not a typo, 1,400 pounds of nitrogen an acre. Don't do that. Trust me, it won't work out for you. The problem that I see here is that, yes, the crude protein increased. A lot of that's going to be nitrates, especially anything above 400 pounds. But I also point out that the digestibility was not statistically improved at all. This digestibility, the energy component, was not improved at all. And my point is that if it is provided good levels of nitrogen, the maturity factor is going to override the nitrogen or the fertility factor. And here's a cool season grass and brome grass. This is from up in the Northwest here. And what we would see in this case is that low nitrogen fertility versus high nitrogen fertility, there's not a dime's worth of difference between them at those 3 different points that they measured it. The main impact was on maturity. As it matured, the digestibility went down. That's the primary driver there. So that's kind of the summary. Those are the 7 factors that are most important in affecting forage quality. There are a few others that we could throw in there and talk about as well. But I want to just end with a couple advertisements, one for our Southeast Hay Contest that we operate in conjunction with the Sunbelt Ag Expo. And when I say we, I mean it is a team effort. Dr. Dillard is involved in this. We've had various folks at Auburn involved in this. Clemson, Florida is heavily involved in this, as are we at the University of Georgia. And the idea behind the Southeast Hay Contest is that it's across all of the 13 states, basically, that we consider to be part of the Southeast that feed into the Sunbelt Ag Expo. And the winner of each of the 7 categories bring home cash prizes. So you can if you get first place, I think it's $150 or something like that, and then 75, 50, something to that effect, plus a few prizes from the sponsors themselves as well. And then the overall grand prize for the person that has the overall high RFQ, they get their choice of a year's use of a Massey Ferguson rotary rake or a Massey Ferguson disc mower. And our friends at Massey Ferguson have been the title sponsor here for Southeast Hay Contest for the last couple of years. Done a great job helping us promote that. This is an old graphic with old dates on it, but the website information actually has the current dates. I think it's the 3rd Thursday in September is when that is going to be due. And then it's the first day of Expo, the 3rd Tuesday of October, where the winners will be announced and the award ceremony will take place. If you have questions about anything I've talked about, including the Southeast Hay Contest, you can get to those from the GeorgiaForages.com website. Brand new look to this, by the way. We just renovated that after about 11 years of good work from our previous website, but we just updated it to reflect the change. So if you've got any questions or comments about that, by the way, we also have a place where you can sign up for email alerts, and you can follow us on Facebook. And if you are friends with us on Facebook, you've seen a lot of activity this week celebrating National Forage Week.